B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, August 5th, 2020. Yesterday, a devastating blast leveled parts of the port of Beirut and damaged buildings as far as 10 miles away. It's a devastating blow to a country that's already on its knees. Partisan, political division, economic collapse, the erosion of the value of the Lebanese lira. And the country has long been riven by political divides that have only gotten worse recently. So initially we were told that there was a fireworks warehouse along the port of Beirut that had caught fire. Then there was a stunning explosion. And by now, many people have seen the video that came from people's cell phones. I've seen it on Twitter and Facebook and on television. The second blast enveloped the skyline as a huge cloud of reddish smoke billowed upward. And from the camera phone video that I saw, the delay in the sound of the blast, the report of it, was 2 to 3 seconds. Now, we are told that there were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, stored in silos or warehouses in the port, and that it's been there for 6 years, that it was stashed after a Russian freighter, the Rosas, arrived in Beirut in November of 2013. And the Lebanese port officials said that the ship was not seaworthy, and they grounded it. The shipment was headed for Mozambique from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And so, after the officials said you cannot sail this vessel, the owner, identified as Igor Grechushkin, a Russian businessman living in Cyprus, basically just wrote it off. He checked out. And so Lebanon was left with this huge pile of ammonium nitrate. And many people know that that was the explosive used to blow up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City that was blamed on Tim McVeigh, and Tim McVeigh pretty much solo. So the reports indicate that as many as 250,000 people have been left homeless. I mean, this is massive. And the estimates of the cost of repair, $3 to $5 billion. The death count keeps climbing. The last number I saw was 130. At least 4,000 people have been wounded. And there's a lot of finger-pointing going on. Now, members of the European Union, led by France, are scheduled to arrive in Beirut tomorrow. The EU said it is activating its civil protection system to round up emergency workers and equipment from across the 27-nation group. And this is a moment that the U.S. will squander. But we could do a lot of good by sending one of those hospital ships that we didn't need for the coronavirus outbreak, by airlifting supplies, including wheat, into Lebanon, because they tell us 85% of their stockpile of wheat was lost in the port of Beirut explosion yesterday. So this is a situation where the international community could really shine and could show what working together we could do. But our America First administration and the outsized influence of the State of Israel will probably preclude any meaningful government action by the U.S. and its allies. Now, it's interesting to note that typically Israel doesn't comment on military actions. It doesn't acknowledge its air raids, even when it's pretty obvious who conducted them. But in this case, Israel has issued a statement that it had no role in the Beirut explosions. We'll come back to that in a moment. So now I'm looking at an article from The Guardian. They show a death count of at least 135 so far. The government said Wednesday evening it is putting an unspecified number of Beirut port officials under house arrest pending an investigation into how the highly explosive materials came to be stored less than 100 meters from a residential neighborhood. The Lebanese prime minister blamed the explosion on that stockpile of ammonium nitrate. And I traced the origins of it for you a moment ago. Still unclear was what set off the ammonium nitrate, which requires extreme heat to ignite. Now, it has been a pretty hot summer in Lebanon, and I believe it usually is pretty hot there through the summer. Several pieces of footage from the moments preceding the blast also showed thick gray smoke billowing from the port, along with a series of small explosions that gave off the red fumes. And they say that this amount of ammonium nitrate is 1,300 times the amount that was used in 1995 in Oklahoma City. Reuters quoted an anonymous source claiming the fire had started at a warehouse number 9 before spreading to warehouse number 12, where the ammonium nitrate was stored. The source of the initial fire is not publicly known. Aerial and drone photos showed a deep crater of blasted land where warehouse 12 once stood. The Lebanese economy minister said damage to the silos had left the country with less than a month's grain reserves, but claimed there's no risk, there is no bread or flour crisis. We have enough inventory and boats are on their way to cover the needs of Lebanon in the long term. So yesterday, after I had recorded my podcast, I went to check on my latest email, and I got a dispatch from Professor Mark Crispin Miller at New York University. And he was merely forwarding, with the one-word comment, terrifying, a post from Celia Farber. And her post reads, "Breaking. What is this? Was a nuclear bomb dropped on Beirut?" Now, I have two minds about this. I think it was a little irresponsible of Professor Miller and Dr. Farber to circulate that kind of speculation, particularly escalating to the idea that this was a nuclear event, with zero evidence. Now, I will acknowledge that the other part of my brain looks at the videos that were shot by residents of Beirut. You say, wow, this is so massive. It's hard to believe that this was accidental. And so then when I got home, I turned on the TV news and learned that at his afternoon briefing on the coronavirus, Trump was asked about the explosion in Beirut. And he said, "I've met with some of our great generals." Is there any other kind, Don? "And they just seemed to feel that this was not some kind of a manufacturing explosion type of event. It was a bomb of some kind." Now, the official Pentagon statements do not reflect any of that speculation. The defense secretary on loan from Raytheon, Mark Esper, said most believe that it was an accident as reported. But he added that the Pentagon is still gathering information about that explosion. So, was Trump once again speculating just based on the wild ravings inside his own head? did those great generals that he met with confide in him that their sources in Israel indicate that the Israelis may have had something to do with it? Trump didn't go into any further detail. And he was roundly criticized on CNN and on MSNBC last night for the comment he made. And so, at the risk of contradicting or appearing hypocritical for my own criticism of Professor Miller and Dr. Farber for speculating about a nuclear event, this morning on Facebook, a friend linked me to a blog post from Tikkun Olam under the byline of Richard Silverstein. And when you look at his bio, he's a credible guy. He is a critic of the state of Israel, and that is a worldview that I share. But Silverstein writes this: a confidential, highly informed Israeli source has told me that Israel caused the massive explosion at the Beirut port earlier today, which killed over 100 and injured thousands. The bombing also virtually leveled the port itself and caused massive damage throughout the city. The article continues. Israel targeted, now here we go into a flat statement here that, I find a little bit suspect, all right? Because, again, this is citing an unnamed source, and Mr. Silverstein is the only source I've seen who is reporting what I have to regard as speculation. All right, he continues. Israel targeted a Hezbollah weapons depot at the port and planned to destroy it with an explosive device. Tragically, Israeli intelligence did not perform due diligence on their target. Thus, they did not know, or if they did know, they didn't care, that there were 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a next-door warehouse. The explosion at the arms depot ignited the next-door warehouse, causing the catastrophe that resulted. A little later, Silverstein writes, though Israel has regularly attacked Hezbollah and Iranian weapons depots and convoys in Syria, it rarely undertakes such brazen attacks inside Lebanon. This attack in the country's capital marks an even greater escalation. The sheer recklessness of this operation is astonishing. And later, Silverstein says, of course, it pains me to admit that Trump was correct in his earlier statement that the explosion was a terrible attack and that the information was conveyed to him by his generals. And he also says, as I noted earlier, normally if Israel has undertaken a successful terror attack such as those against Iran, it will either refuse to comment or a senior military or political figure will say something like, while we refuse to comment, whoever did it did the world a favor. In this case, he notes, Israel immediately denied responsibility. Now, at best, this is circumstantial evidence driven by an anonymous source said to be highly placed in the Israeli government or military establishment. But I do think it is worth consideration. And as the days go by, we can hope for an investigation that might reveal more. In the meantime, we are left with mere speculation, and I want to be clear about that. So I was not the only one to notice yesterday when Trump tweeted that mail-in balloting in Florida, whether it's called absentee or just mail-in balloting, is A-OK with con man Don. But when a state like Nevada, run by a Democratic governor, embraces mail-in balloting, Trump goes ballistic and threatens to sue. And so what we're seeing is that Trump is very concerned that his attacks on voting by mail are working, but only with Republicans. And he now has to confront the prospect, despite all his bluster and denials and blue sky and, this virus is going to be over someday, that his own fate could be decided by Republicans who don't sign up for mail-in ballots and then stay away from the polls on Election Day because they don't consider it safe to go out. And so the Trump team is trying to parse this, and I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning on the same message points. And their claim is that absentee balloting basically requires you to submit identification and a request for a ballot, and they act like in other states they're just going to mail out ballots to people like junk mail. And whoever returns one gets to vote, and of course they won't be vetted, they won't be checked against the registration. The signature matching system, as I've criticized, is far from perfect. But it is one way that they determine whether a mail-in ballot came from somebody who is properly registered in that county or other jurisdiction. And so in their effort to spin up fear about a shift to mail-in balloting, and in my view, they're concerned about it because all of their efforts to suppress the vote of Democrats have been aimed at polling places. They scrub you from the rolls. They block it because you don't have a photo ID. All of the games that they play operate most effectively when people go to the polls and are not permitted to vote. But mail-in voting has the prospect of increasing turnout substantially and bypassing the Republican voter suppression schemes. So Laura Trump, who I believe is married to Eric, I think I have that right, she tweeted, or I guess she actually is quoted in an advertisement that is running in Florida. She says, "My father-in-law, President Trump, has always supported absentee voting with safeguards in place. We want you to know there's a difference between the Democrat-imposed vote-by-mail systems and the vote-by-mail systems you have in Florida. In Florida, you as the voter must both register and request your absentee ballot. This is very different and a much more secure process than when the Democrats mail everyone in the state a ballot, often resulting in ballots being mailed to abandoned addresses, individuals not registered to vote." And she doesn't mention it, but they're thinking about dead people as well. And in a rebuttal, under the byline of Greg Sargent in today's Washington Post, he rebuts Laura Trump. "So to be clear," he writes, "they are demanding that safeguards like that one. Oh, let me go back a paragraph. Those state laws could make the disenfranchising effects of delays in receiving ballots much worse, according to voting rights experts, by resulting in untold numbers of ballots that arrive late being invalidated. Democrats are litigating in those states to get late-arriving ballots accepted. Trump and Republicans are fighting against that, screaming about fraud. So to be clear, they are demanding that safeguards like that one remain in place in those other swing states in order to invalidate votes they think will be against them, even if those votes arrive late due to postal delays and through no fault of voters themselves." And later he says this also serves the nefarious goal of legitimizing in advance mail votes in places where Trump thinks they will help him, while delegitimizing them in advance where he thinks they will hurt. And in one exchange at the briefing yesterday, Trump was asked, why Florida's okay and other states aren't. And he flatly said, because they've got a Republican governor. So this infects the voting process with partisan considerations that come from the twisted mind of the guy with that bad comb-over. And I think that he has operated in a way that confuses a lot of people. And I don't think this is going to help him in the way that he imagines. So yesterday, primaries that had been postponed from earlier in the spring and early summer were held in Arizona, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, and Washington. And there were some good wins for progressives. In Detroit, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib had a decisive win over the primary challenger she first faced in 2018, so she will cruise to victory. She defeated the president of the Detroit City Council by a margin of 66-34. In Missouri, Cori Bush, an activist who came out of Ferguson, defeated the longtime Congressman William Lacey Clay, who inherited that seat from his father, and it's been a family possession now for 52 years. And Clay was defeated by, I believe, 6 or 8 points in the latest count that I saw. The issue there was that he had not paid attention to Black Lives Matter in the wake of the events of Ferguson and was out of touch with his black constituency. Missouri voters also supported a proposal to expand Medicaid eligibility under the Affordable Care Act, hoping to cover over 200,000 low-income people. And I cheered when I heard the news that Chris Kobach of Kansas, the guy who was the leader of the Republican voter suppression tactics in the last couple of election cycles, was unable to rig his own election. And he lost to what is described as a more moderate Republican Congressman, Roger Marshall, for a race for the Senate seat in Kansas. Now, I'm a little surprised to see that in Maricopa County, Arizona, Joe Arpaio, the sheriff who was drummed out, clearly broke the law and then was pardoned by Trump, who declared him a great American. At the age of something like 88, Arpaio is running to regain his job as the sheriff, and he has denied a clear win to his opponent, the guy who succeeded him as sheriff. So we will have to await the final count in that race. So it is interesting to see how people get excited. And Cori Bush's victory is an exciting one. I'm glad to see it. But the Washington Post did a recap of all of the members of Congress who have lost their primaries so far. And as you know, there are 435 members of the House currently, and only 7 incumbents have been forced into retirement by voters so far. There are a few more primaries still to go. But it shows how the power of incumbency is so hard to break. And since there are only 7, let's run them down. I mentioned William Lacey Clay. You know about Elliot Engel, who's been defeated by the former middle school principal, Jamal Bowman. Then there is the Republican congressman from Kansas who was accused of voting illegally. That is Watkins, I think Steve Watkins, and he was ousted by voters last night. Dan Lipinski, an alleged Democrat from southern Illinois who served in Congress for 15 years, was finally bounced as one of the last anti-abortion Democrats in Congress. Steve King in Iowa, who had been there for 17 years, he got bounced for his racist remarks, or at least that was one issue. And 2 other Republicans have been unseated, Denver Riggleman in Virginia and Scott Tipton in Colorado. They were not long-termers. Riggleman was really in his first term. He got bounced for officiating at a same-sex wedding. And Scott Tipton of Colorado was a 9-year incumbent, and he was booted for not being considered conservative enough. So the Democratic National Convention, scheduled for mid-August in Milwaukee, it's going to be all Zoom. They've announced that the nominee, Joe Biden, will not be there for his coronation. He will be accepting the nomination from his home state of Delaware, maybe even from the basement where he's been doing his video conferencing from. The delegates have already been told not to show up. And whatever speechifying goes on will be done remotely. They're saying some people from Wisconsin might actually go to the convention. But beyond that, it will be entirely virtual. And today, Mr. Biden got a little bit testy. A national correspondent for CBS News, Errol Barnett, popped a question to him. He said, your opponent, Donald Trump, has made your mental state a campaign topic. And when asked in June if you've been tested for cognitive decline, you responded, you're constantly tested. And he said that Biden should clarify that. Has he actually taken a test? And Biden, apparently a little testy, said, no, I haven't taken a test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying to you before you got on this program, did you take a test where you were taking cocaine or not? What do you think, huh? Are you a junkie? Not the smoothest move there, Uncle Joe. Today on Capitol Hill, because the Senate is not taking any action to deal with the crisis that confronts so many working Americans, the trifecta that I described, the cutoff of the $600 a week federal unemployment add-on, the impending crisis of evictions, and the loss of health care, which Iowans address to some extent. No, they're working on distractions. We've got a couple of them for you today. Former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, she served just on an interim basis before the Trump team took over in January of 2017. And she was up before the Lindsey Graham Judiciary Committee of the Senate. And Graham is running this investigation into the Russiagate investigation. And as you know, I think there are legitimate issues to be raised there, and that Lindsey Graham is extremely partisan, and we can't rely on him to do an unbiased job at this. So, first of all, Trump has it in for Sally Yates. He started tweeting just before the hearing began that she has zero credibility, that she's part of the greatest political crime of the century, and Obama-Biden knew everything. And so Graham was focusing on what she knew about Mike Flynn, his conversation with the Russian ambassador Kislyak just after Christmas in 2016. And if you recall, as part of the claim that Russia meddled in the 2016 election to help Trump, the Obama administration had expelled dozens of suspected Russian intelligence agents, shut down a couple of their facilities, including one in San Francisco. And Yates said today, General Flynn had essentially neutered the U.S. government's message of deterrence. Instead of rebuking the Russian government, she said Flynn had been conciliatory. Now, I have seen quotes. I haven't seen the full transcript of the phone call between Flynn and Kislyak. And I don't think being conciliatory is a crime for somebody who is supposed to be conducting diplomacy. And I refer to both Flynn and Kislyak in that respect. But she went on to say that meeting, the one on January 5th in the White House, was not about an investigation at all, she said. That is something that would have crossed the line. She said if Obama or Biden, now the Democrats' presumptive nominee to challenge Trump in November, had talked about the investigation of Flynn, that would have set off alarms for me. The main point of the meeting, she said, was to figure out what the Russians were up to. When Republicans questioned Yates about her approval of a FISA court application to extend the wiretapping and warrants on Carter Page, she did acknowledge that she now knows that there were errors in those documents, but she said she didn't know about them. I wouldn't sign anything that I knew to contain errors or omissions. I would never knowingly do that, she said. So I believe that the combination of Bill Barr, the Durham investigation, Lindsey Graham's Senate hearings, and the other team run by Ron Johnson investigating Ukraine, I think they are ready to spring an October surprise to try to damage Joe Biden in the few weeks remaining before the election. And we're just at 92 days now, I think, from the November election. The other Senate hearing held yesterday in Washington, chaired by Ted Cruz at the Senate Judiciary Committee. He chaired an hours-long spectacle of a hearing designed to peddle misleading narratives about anarchists and anti-fascists. The headline, or the title of the hearing was, "The Right of the People Peaceably to Assemble, Protecting Speech by Stopping Anarchist Violence." But Cruz based his attacks on a lie. Back at the end of May, a federal security guard named Dave Underwood was shot and killed during a protest across the bay from me in Oakland. And Ted Cruz left the clear impression that it was the left that killed Underwood, that it was Antifa. But it's very well known that the alleged shooter, Steve Carrillo, who is a sergeant in the Air Force, that he's a boogaloo guy. He is a right-wing white supremacist. But that's not what Ted Cruz is looking for. Despite testimony from Mike German, the former FBI agent who's been on this program, he talked about the sensationalist focused on the far left that is distracted from focus on the deadly threats posed by the far right. As a matter of policy, far-right violence is deprioritized, German testified. Previously, he's been quoted as saying, "You have these heavily armed groups right there who have much more direct and lengthy history of violence than anything Antifa or anarchists-involved groups do." So it would be interesting if Ted Cruz was really trying to get to the bottom of who the agent provocateurs were in Minneapolis and at other locations during protests after the George Floyd killing. But he's not really interested in that, just in demonizing the left and doing Trump's bidding to make Antifa seem much more pervasive and threatening than it actually is. And to be fair, this article at The Intercept points out that Senate Democrats didn't do any favors to the protests either. Mazie Hirono, senator from Hawaii, I'm quoting here, may have made welcome reference to the scourge of white supremacist violence, but she also dismissed the serious and reasonable demand to defund the police at the center of the protests. "Who takes that literally?" she said. "I certainly don't." And that's why we've got a problem in this country today, because there isn't enough difference between Republicans and Democrats. Last night in Portland, I believe it was night 67 of protests there. There was a little skirmish, but the police, I think, inappropriately declared a riot because the skirmish took place outside of the police union headquarters. And the incidents described were that a man drove a pickup truck through the protesters' crowd, and he was dragging a motorcycle under the front bumper of his truck. Then he hopped out and produced a gun to keep protesters away from him, and no one was injured in that incident. Oh, and let me correct, it's day 69, not day 67. So then the protesters gathered in a park, about 100 of them, and they marched to the Portland Police Association building. They were there for several hours, and ultimately some demonstrators broke through the doors of that building, went inside at about 1 o'clock in the morning. They caused damage and lit a small fire. And that's when police declared a riot, and several people were arrested, and it broke up about 3:30 a.m. I mentioned to you last week that the authorities in Portland have been fining the federal government for unauthorized erection of a fence outside of the Hatfield United States Courthouse in downtown Portland. They are fining the federal government $500 every 15 minutes. That's $2,000 an hour. That's $48,000 a day. And as of noon Wednesday, The fine is at $584,000. I doubt that they'll ever collect a penny. Seattle's Mayor Jenny Durkan and its police chief Carmen Best are pushing back on the city council's desire to follow through on pledges to further reduce the police budget in Seattle. Durkan and Best have urged the council to hold off on additional cuts until the next budget year. And one of the proposals coming from the activist members of the city council would include 70 layoffs of cops and assume 30 unplanned resignations. Those jobs wouldn't be filled. That would produce some savings, a few $1,000,000, and that would be diverted into other purposes. But even that upsets Durkan and Best. The mayor, quote, "I would just urge the council again, take some time. It's a step forward to have admitted you were wrong." Well, this follows a plan that was announced earlier that cut about $20 million from the police budget. But it doesn't appear that those plans have been implemented. So there is a technical issue under the police union contract. They are supposed to lay off based on seniority. And unfortunately, that would leave a lot of the so-called bad apples, the old-timers who are used to excessive power and the use of excessive force. They would keep their jobs while the younger, more recent hires would be laid off. But there is a loophole, an exemption in the contract that allows the layoffs to be held out of the order of seniority when the police chief shows that that approach is necessary. Now, I don't know all the fine print. Apparently, it would require arbitration of each individual case. But the mayor and police chief are trying to avoid it altogether. Over at Facebook, when somebody posts an ad that includes falsehoods, lies, Facebook will either take it down or they will flag it and say this video contains questionable statements, something like that. But when it comes to Trump, they're allowing him to lie with impunity. Now, I want to be clear about one point. If a politician who's running for office submits an ad to a TV station or a cable channel that includes false statements, in most cases, the media platform is required to broadcast that. Political speech has the highest level of court-approved freedom in this country. But Facebook doesn't treat all politicians in the same manner. It has fact-checking organizations, 5 of them. Some are conservative groups that have found Trump's ads claiming that Joe Biden wants to defund the police to be flat-out false. But Facebook isn't even flagging them, much less removing them. And the false ad about Biden and defunding has been seen at least 22.5 million times on Facebook. It's being targeted at users in Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And so it does raise the question, have those dinners that Zuck has had with Trump made a difference? Is there special treatment of Trump's lies over the lies of other politicians when they show up on Facebook? And I thought we heard a threat that Facebook was going to ban all political advertising. Haven't seen that yet. And my concern about that is that there are a lot of local races for city council, for state legislature, that are run at the district level, and Facebook is a perfect platform because you can target by zip code or IP address and reach only the people who are in your district. And I would hate to see those local races denied access to an important media platform. Here's today's COVID-19 report edited by Linda Lewis. First, we go to the statistics. Worldwide, we have reported 18.5 million cases. Total deaths have just climbed over 700,000. In the United States, 4.7 million cases, total deaths now at almost 157,000. Yesterday, we added 1,399, call it 1,400, new reported deaths. Some of those may have been picked up from lagging reports over the weekend, as we've suggested. Texas was delaying reporting, and Florida, because of the hurricane, had stopped testing and reduced its reporting. Also, Linda included this data from the Indian Health Service. They have shown that Native Americans have tested positive at the rate of about 33,000, and that is an increase of about 1% from a couple of weeks ago. And Linda starts off with a note here. For years, emergency planners have urged government officials to invest more resources in mitigation, actions taken up front to reduce the severity of a disaster, including the appearance of a deadly new organism, because it's been found to reduce overall costs of disaster and results in better decision-making. But a new analysis published in the journal Science found that responding to a pandemic is 500 times more expensive than taking preventive measures. The authors call for a worldwide shift toward preventive action. They also identify factors associated with the risk of future pandemics, like deforestation, wet markets, and the global trade in wild animals. Co-author of the study from Boston University, Professor Les Kaufman, says there are many people who might object to the United States fronting money, but it's in our own best interest. Nothing seems more prudent than to give ourselves time to deal with the pandemic before the next one comes. Michael Osterholm, who is director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, has published a new op-ed where he compares COVID-19 to a wildfire. In the coming months, he writes, U.S. morbidity and mortality will largely depend on how much fuel the COVID-19 wildfire has access to. While a full Wuhan-style lockdown is impractical, we need to get as close as we can in hotspots of dangerously increasing case counts, suspending all but strictly essential services to get transmission down to a manageable level. This is an extremely delicate balancing act since so many functions are necessary to keep society going. Yet areas that observe tight shelter-in-place constraints like New York and some countries in Asia and Europe showed that we can bring the deadly numbers down and bring back the economy in a safer public environment. And this, of course, speaks to the calls that, based on the recent expansion of positive results coming in both rural and urban areas, that we should be contemplating a second lockdown. We are also learning from a report from pathologists at NYU that the examination of cadavers whose deaths were caused or alleged to have been caused by COVID-19 showed that it is not just a respiratory disease, but the virus can cause blood clots all over the body. Now, this can lead to kidney failure, heart inflammation, immune system complications, strokes. The study suggests that blood clots can also affect smaller blood vessels. And this was dramatic because, though we might have expected it in the lungs, we found it in almost every organ that we looked at in our autopsy study. So this shows the dimensions of this novel coronavirus. And Linda, in a parenthetical note here, adds, recently a longtime friend of my family died suddenly and unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism caused by a blood clot. Since the start of the year, 3 other friends and family have also died, 2 from strokes. There were no signs that suggested the deaths were from COVID-19, but having read that the virus causes blood clotting, I began to wonder if it's possible for someone to have a stroke, heart attack, or embolism from COVID-19 blood clotting with no other obvious symptoms. The answer to that question, she says, I discovered is yes, although it doesn't appear to be common based on current knowledge. So then there's a report from a Dallas TV station. Andre Tanner was watching TV when he noticed pain in his chest and his heart started to beat very fast. He felt pain on his left side, became dizzy. He reached for his phone, called his mom, and seconds later he blacked out, didn't remember anything till he woke up in the emergency room. He didn't have a fever, wasn't coughing, so he said doctors continued to go through a checklist to identify what was wrong. And after ordering some tests, they found that he had 2 major blood clots on both sides of his lung. That's where they ordered a COVID-19 test as a precautionary. I was sent to the ICU. That's where they found 2 more blood clots in my right leg, 1 in my left leg, and then the COVID test came back positive. This is a 23-year-old. He said he was in disbelief because he never had symptoms and had tested negative just a week before. So I will add that one of the cases I know about of a young man who is serving in the military who was hospitalized for COVID-19. He's been released and is in generally good health. But the hospitalization was related to concern over blood clots in his lungs. So this is an interesting advance of our knowledge about this pesky and complicated virus. Now, on the delays in testing across the United States, the San Jose Mercury News reports that turnaround times have doubled. And of course, the longer it takes for you to get back your test results, the less valid and valuable they are. Because if you're getting back a negative 2 weeks after you took the test, you could have been infected in the meantime. And if you're getting a positive, you may have infected others in the meantime. So Dr. Tom Frieden, former head of the CDC, noting that commercial labs perform 2.5 million tests a week, about half of our total, said that results are very delayed and of little utility. They charge, but the public doesn't benefit. Tests performed per day is a very misleading indicator. County labs are also typically dependent on public or commercial labs with limited flexibility. Some of the worst delays for results are at labs at public retail outlets like the CVS drugstore chain. Such places send the tests in bulk to centralized labs owned by just a few commercial processors. These processors use just 1 or 2 types of instruments, so they're locked into using proprietary chemical kits and other tools. So this is a serious problem, and it is pathetic that we have been at this for months now, that we knew that testing was going to be a critical component to emerging from the original lockdowns in the spring. Now we know that Crown Prince Jared Kushner was put in charge of developing the national testing strategy, and when it was determined that it was going to benefit blue states too much, they shelved the whole damn thing. Let them die. I mean, it's really grotesque. And we are left to fend for ourselves in far too many cases here. The big questions remain: will schools open in the fall? And whether at the university level, the high school level, or even middle school and elementary. The answers are largely coming back, you'll be Zooming to your school. Chicago announced that its schools will open online only, at least for the first month. Of the nation's 25 largest school districts, only 5 now plan to open the school year with any form of in-person learning. 6 of the 7 largest will be online. And so this is, we've got Trump who just tweets, "Open the schools," with 4 exclamation points. And we know that at this point, I think the educators are making the right decision, especially after what we learned from what happened when they reopened schools in Israel back in May. This is an issue I've been thinking about a lot. A student at Yale University is suing for a refund because of the incomplete that the university deserves for the spring quarter or semester. John Michel, a student, said he paid $27,000 in tuition for the spring semester and was suing on behalf of members of his class who did not receive the full value of the services for which they paid. And I think there's going to be a moment of reckoning here, because if your education was worth $27,000 when you went to campus, used the facilities and all that, got to have a session with a professor or a teaching assistant, much of that is now unavailable. The value of it has clearly declined. And the universities, which are used to raising rates whenever they want, jacking up student debt without any concern for the liabilities that their graduates carry, well, I think it's pretty obscene. New York is amping up its efforts to intercept people who try to enter the Empire State on bridges or other highway checkpoints. So they're establishing positions where they're going to randomly stop vehicles, tell them that they need to quarantine for 14 days if they're going to stay in New York, and file forms about where they can be reached. Yesterday, I reported that California is cautiously optimistic because over the past 2 weeks, we've seen a decline of about 21% in the average of new cases reported daily. But now we're learning of a serious glitch in the electronic data system that is being used to collect all of this information. And we are told that a serious undercount may have afflicted the figures that gave us the cautious optimism. And I'm sure we're not the only state who is having those issues. I'm also concerned, as you know, about the shift away from the CDC into a private contractor controlled by the Trump administration as the center where all of the data are being collected. And here, just down the road from me at San Quentin State Prison, we now have deaths 20 and 21 occurred over the weekend. One of them was a man on death row, the 9th person on the row to die of COVID-19. But they have reduced, at one point they had 1,600 reported infections, and now they have reduced that to 168. So there have been a lot of people who either never developed symptoms or who have recovered, at least if these data points can be given credibility. Gilead, the profiteering pharmaceutical company that's based here in the Bay Area, they're under a lot of pressure as a bipartisan group of more than 30 state attorneys general is calling on the Department of Health and Human Services to use their extraordinary powers to license the manufacture of remdesivir to someone other than the exclusive license holder, Gilead. As you know, taxpayers have subsidized the development of remdesivir to the tune of $70 million, but Gilead wants a course of treatment to be priced at about $3,000. They say they set their price not by what it costs, but what the value of it is. Yeah. Now, if you own a business, you might be offered business interruption coverage by your insurance carrier. A lot of people took it. But for various reasons, the insurers are saying no dice. And what's curious to me is they're not injecting the phrase force majeure, act of God, which is in many contracts, not just insurance contracts, saying that this is beyond the control of humans and of the insurance industry. But a group of restaurant owners have formed a class action to sue to get the insurance companies to cough up some money. Business interruption coverage, comes with policies that define what it actually covers. So if a flood washes away a building or a fire burns your inventory, forcing a business closure, that appears to be covered. But they're saying that insurers are refusing to pay for loss or damage caused by any virus, bacterium, illness, or disease. Well, that one's going to be in court for a while, I think we can expect. Over at the State Department, Mike Pompeo doesn't have to look over his shoulder because the acting inspector general who replaced the guy who Pompeo got fired a couple of weeks ago, he has quit himself. His name is Steve Akard. He was the acting inspector general after Steve Linick was bounced. And, of course, there are two investigations that the inspector general was running. One, that Mike Pompeo and his wife misused government resources for travel and getting government employees to pick up their dry cleaning and stuff like that. But the more serious issue was whether Pompeo broke the law when he issued paper that permitted Saudi Arabia to follow through on a weapons purchase last fall. And that bypass of Congress is being scrutinized very carefully, and that appears to be why Steve Linick was fired. And selling those arms to the Saudis, despite restrictions from Congress, I believe is a pretty serious issue. I want to thank John Zwiebel for sharing a report with me from Middle East Eye, showing that Saudi Arabia has constructed a facility to extract uranium yellowcake from uranium ore. Now, Saudi Arabia does apparently have domestic supplies of uranium, and they've built a facility, again, I think I mentioned, with the assistance of China, that is described as being in the northeast portion of the kingdom of the House of Saud. The main concern is that as they move ahead with developing a nuclear program, it is keeping the door open for creation of nuclear weapons. And it also points up the hypocrisy of our treatment of Iran. Iran has made it clear they want to build nuclear power plants. I don't approve of any more nuclear power plants anywhere on the planet. But we also see the Saudis trying to diversify away from dependence on oil, both for income and for energy. And so if Iran can develop nuclear power and nuclear enrichment, well, it just shows that we are not being fair by permitting different standards for the Saudis and the Iranians. Every day I pause when I remember to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast for your subscriptions. Today I want to thank Jim McHugh, Julie Dupree, George Mashke, and Kush Khatri, who is a recently signed-up subscriber here. I appreciate each and every one of you, and if you would like to emulate them, all you have to do is go to peterbcollins.com/sign-up, and the options are right there for you to consider. Also, I want to acknowledge a note from Abby McMillan, loyal listener and subscriber from Maine. She says, I had wondered why the local post office couldn't just take incoming ballots and hand them to the local election officials. And she said she wants to report that in her small town in Maine, if I want to mail a letter across town, it first has to go from our post office to the central sorting station in the town of Hampton, over an hour away, where automatic readers sort all the mail and redistribute it into boxes that go back to town to our local carrier, hopefully in the precise order that she'll deliver them on her route. All mail our local PO takes in, no matter its destination, is dumped into bags that go to Hamden. Now, I do understand this. FedEx uses a similar process nationally where everything goes to Memphis. And then even if you shipped it, you're shipping it across town, it goes to Memphis and then it comes back. But I believe that there are ways that the mail of ballots, both outbound to voters and inbound to the registrars, can be segregated and not put through that particular process. Well, this is a little surprising. As you may know, the Trump administration has leaned on the EPA to give a Canadian company a license to mine for gold and copper in the environmentally sensitive salmon fishery of Bristol Bay, Alaska. Well, get this. Nick Ayers, VP Pence's former chief of staff, is a big fan of Bristol Bay. And he said, like millions of conservationists and sportsmen, I'm hoping Donald Trump will direct EPA to block the Pebble mine in Bristol Bay. A Canadian company will unnecessarily mine the USA's greatest fishery at a severe cost. This should be stopped, and I believe POTUS will do so. Guess who retweeted that? Don Jr. But don't worry, Daddy won't intervene. No golf courses at Bristol Bay. And finally today, Ariana Picari has resigned from MSNBC, where she was a producer on the Lawrence O'Donnell show. And she wrote a letter that is mildly blistering about how decisions are made about what to cover at MSDNC. And Picari, who came out of public radio, said at NPR, no decision I ever witnessed was predicated on how a topic or a guest would show up in the ratings. The longer I was at MSNBC, the more I saw such choices. It's practically baked into the editorial process, and those decisions affect news content every day. Likewise, she said, it's taboo to discuss how the rating scheme distorts content, or it's simply taken for granted because everyone in the commercial broadcast news industry is doing the same exact thing. Now, she has a very legitimate gripe here. But she could go much further, and she didn't, so I will. MSNBC does everything about ratings. They are pandering to a narrow subset of the U.S. population that leans toward the Democratic Party. And, at least in prime time, they don't have newscasts, that cover what I covered, Ted Cruz and, Lindsey Graham. They only cover stories that would presumably drive up the negatives of Donald Trump and feed the bias of the typical viewer who hates Trump and revels in hearing the latest dirt about him. And so Rachel Maddow is not doing much coverage of the Democratic primaries. Joe Biden is the presumptive nominee, and so there is no interest in reporting on the ups and downs of his campaign. It is a distorted environment, and it's not going to change because that's how they make their money, and it's how they feed their corporate sponsors, the corporate leaders, and the political officials who they consider themselves aligned with. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.